So good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Rose Tileston. I'm the Senior Manager of Urban Forestry at American Forest. And what I do at American Forest is I do financial management of grants to local nonprofit organizations so that they can work with us in putting on tree planting events for corporate and foundation sponsors. But in addition to my work for our urban forestry program, I also manage the National Champion Tree Program. And part of the National Champion Tree Program is producing the National Register of Champion Trees every year. Um, so what I'm going to be going over with today with you is I'm going to share a little bit about American Forest. I'm going to share about champion tree programs in general and how a tree is on the national register or a state register. So to start, I would share some background information about American Forest. American Forest was founded in 1875 as the American Forestry Association by physician and horticulturalist John Aston Warder and a group of concerned citizens. About a decade after the Civil War, tremendous development and industrial expansion was occurring in the United States. Forests were being cut down at an alarming rate to make way for farms, towns, and railways, and timber barons were exploiting what then seemed like an inexhaustible resource. The American Forestry Association was created as a response to the rapid and wasteful post-war development, which was destroying our forests. American Forest's mission today is to create healthy and resilient forests from cities to wilderness that deliver essential benefits for climate, people, water, and wildlife. We advance our mission through forestry innovation, place-based partnerships to plant and restore forests, and movement building. We have a vision of a world in which the significant environmental, societal, and economic benefits of forests are fully realized and equitably available to all people. I'd now like to share with you a little bit about the history of champion tree programs. So in 1925, a man by the name of Fred W. Besley was known as the Dean of State Foresters, and he was Maryland's first state forester. Fred, pioneered the Champion Big Tree program in the state of Maryland, and he standardized the method for measuring large trees. He not only had a love for large trees, though, he also loved photography. And so he would stop along the way and he would take pictures of large trees with people standing next to them. And then over time, Fred's measuring methods were adopted across the country. And Fred's Champion Big Tree program from the state of the Maryland state program, it actually went national when he became the director of American Forest. And he worked as the director of American Forest for 18 years. So with people already thinking about big trees in their state, thanks to Fred, the first call to find the largest trees in the nation came in September 1940. A concerned forester by the name of Joseph Stern published the article, "Let's Find and Save the Biggest Trees." And he published this article in an issue of American Forest magazine. But when he published this article, he wasn't referring to famous and historic trees that were already protected. He was referring to giant trees that had been left in virgin forests. In this picture here is Lillian Cromlin. She was the associate editor of American Forest magazine, and she created the initial list for American Forest in 1940. And so although the National Register of Champion Trees started out as an awareness campaign, it quickly turned into a competition, a national hunt to discover and preserve the largest specimens of American tree species. The trees that people search for today are scattered through the forests that we have, our fields. They're found along roadways, they're found in people's backyards, they're found in parks, and they're found in cemeteries. The name of the National Register has changed over the years. In 1940, it was first called American Big Trees. And then the name changed in 1961 to the Social Register of Big Trees. It changed again in 1978 to the National Register of Big Trees. And finally, it changed once more in 2014 to what we know it today, which is the National Register of Champion Trees. So I've spoken a bit about how the National Champion Tree Program came into existence, but it's important to share that there are actually big or champion tree programs in nearly all 50 states. And these state programs are housed in under state departments and agencies. They're housed within universities, such as the University of Tennessee. They're housed by nonprofit organizations, and they're housed under volunteer groups, which are people that are very passionate about big trees and they want to have a program within their state, but there is no organization that is willing to take it on. It's also important to share that the state programs are all very different. They're all unique in their own way, and they all have various amounts of capacity and funding. And some of them actually run their programs a little bit differently than we do at American Forests. But all of the programs look to American Forest's National Champion Trees program as a role model. So, how does a tree make it onto a state register or a national register of big trees or champion trees? Well, first, a tree that's nominated, or I should say a specimen that's nominated to the National Register of Champion Trees in particular, needs to be living. It needs to be a species that we consider eligible for the National Register. The tree needs to have been verified by an expert, which means that just because somebody nominates a tree to the National Register doesn't mean that it's automatically eligible to be crowned a national champion tree. We first need to have an expert confirm what the member of the public reported to us. Are the tree measurements correct? Is the species ID correct? Is the tree really living? And then finally, for a tree to become a national champion, it has to be the largest of its species that has been reported to us at American Forests. This means that although the National Register of Champion Trees houses a list of the largest trees in the country, there's definitely an opportunity or possibility for there to be larger trees out there. They just haven't been discovered yet, or they haven't been reported to us. So what trees are eligible? What species are eligible? Well, specifically, the National Register of Champion Trees accepts native tree species and non-native and naturalized tree species. We don't recognize hybrids, cultivars, ornamentals, or unclassified varieties. And the reason for this is really strictly just because of capacity. There's over 900 scientific names on our eligible species list. If we included hybrids, cultivars, ornamentals, and varieties, the list could very quickly become quite unwieldy. It's important to note that although these criteria that I've outlined here are American Forest guidelines for trees that are eligible for our National Register, these criteria are not the same across state programs. They're different. Some states accept exotic species that are not naturalized. Some recognize cultivars, some recognize hybrids, Some recognize invasive species and others don't. And so it's important to note that every state manages their program a little bit differently. And the way that they manage their program is based on their capacity and the interests of their audience. So what makes a tree a champion? Well, as I mentioned before, champion trees are the largest of their species as nominated to their state register or to the national register. Each tree, though, is evaluated according to a point system. 1 point for each inch of circumference, 1 point for each foot of height, and 1 point for each quarter of crown spread. After the tree's measurements have been collected, the final score is calculated using the formula shown on this slide. Circumference in inches plus height in feet plus 1/4 of the total crown spread in feet will give us the total points for a particular specimen. I use the term specimen because when plants are nominated to the National Register in particular, they also have to meet our growth form criteria, which means that we look at the form of the specimen that's been nominated to the National Register of Champion Trees, because sometimes people will nominate plant specimens that are growing more in the form of a shrub. And we know that woody plants can take the form of a shrub or a tree. So we try to be a little bit specific here of what we're looking for. Champions and co-champions. Trees are crowned champions or co-champions if they are the largest tree of their species nominated to the National Register of Champion Trees. Again, it's important to note that the states manage their programs differently. Trees are crowned co-champions if their total points are within 3% or 3 points of each other, whichever is larger. If two trees are under 100 points, the trees will be crowned co-champions if they are within 3 points of each other. If they are over 100 points, it will be 3% of the larger tree's total points. Some state programs do this a little bit differently, and they actually have it within 5 points or within 5% of each other. We're a little bit tighter in terms of our point difference at the national level. So once a tree is crowned a national champion tree or a national co-champion tree, does that mean that it can be a champion forever? The short answer to that is no. A tree is not indefinitely eligible to be a national champion tree for American forests. We have a rule in place called the 10-year rule. The 10-year rule specifies that a tree that has been nominated to the National Register of Champion Trees and has been verified by an expert must then be re-verified at least once in the 10 years after its first verification. We have this rule to confirm that a tree is still living. We know that trees die for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes hurricanes hit, sometimes there are fires, sometimes they're cut down due to development. And so we want to ensure that we're not leaving dead trees in the national champion tree position so that we can make way for new champions that are still living. Our re-verification process means that we need, again, for an expert to confirm that the tree is still living. We ask that new measurements are taken and submitted to us at American Forest. We ask for new photographs to be submitted. And this is very important because the photographs can reveal a lot of information about a tree. Is it healthy? Where it's located? It can give us a lot of information for when we want to go back and visit the tree again the next time in the next 10 years. And so this re-verification maintains the eligibility of a particular tree or helps it to maintain its current champion status. Currently, on the National Register of Champion Trees, we have over 600 national champion trees. It's important to note that national champion trees usually are the largest of their particular species. So generally speaking, on average, we have about 600 species represented on the National Register of Champion Trees. People can nominate a tree to American Forest by using our online nomination form, which is found on American Forest website. And our register is released once per year. The nomination period for this year closes at the end of this month on May 31st. And this year's 2021 National Register of Champion Trees will be released at the end of September. So why are champion trees important? Well, champion trees add value to property. We know that. They provide all the benefits that any tree provides. They clean our air, they clean our water, they help mitigate the heat island effect. But I think some even more important points are that these programs, the state level and the national level, big and champion tree programs, contribute to our understanding of science. They answer the question, how big can trees get? And also, when we're recording why a tree is no longer a champion, especially in terms of tree mortality, we're recording why or the causes of tree death. So there's a scientific benefit to these programs. Additionally, champion trees are important for climate change. We know that the biggest trees are holding the most carbon. And we also know that the biggest trees in our country are dying at a very fast pace due to our changing climate. Champion tree programs at the state or the national level are also important because they create awareness about the vast biodiversity that we have of tree species within the United States. And many of these champion trees are champions not only of their species, but it's important to note that these species many times are also threatened or endangered. And so we're enabling the public a rare opportunity to see photographs of a tree species that they otherwise might not have seen or been aware of. And lastly, champion trees are also known and seen as mother trees oftentimes in our wilderness ecosystems. We know that mother trees are producing offspring for new forests and that they're supporting the ecosystems around them. So, on the surface, the champion tree programs might just seem like a competition, but there's so much more than that. They show us the value of trees. They encourage us to conserve our forests and our ecosystems. And these programs enable us to, or they encourage us to have friendly competition and to connect with our communities. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for giving me the time to speak with you today and for the opportunity to present about the National Champion Tree Program and also a little bit about the state champion tree programs. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Now it's recording and I am muting. Take it away, Bob.
Okay, thank you, Sharon, and hello, everybody. My name is Bob Leverett, and I'll be your presenter. A couple of points there. I'm the co-founder of the Native Tree Society, and I'm a senior advisor to American Forest Champion Tree Program. So with that introduction,
You co-wrote the Bible.
I also, yes, I co-wrote the guidelines that are used by American Forest. It's an 86-page handbook, which is a little intimidating, I think, but you all are the experts. So I look forward to talking to you and presenting to you. Okay, with that in mind, why does it not move forward? Oh, there we go. We will cover in this session definition of a tree height. Then we'll look at the methods that we use to measure height, and then talk about some of the sources of error. Now, past that, we'll then look at measuring girth or circumference, and then after that, finally wind up with crown spread. Okay, so let's start off with a simple definition. What do we mean by tree height? And this diagram kind of says what most of us probably have in mind. We think of a tree as vertically oriented, and the vertical separation of the top from the base is what we call the height, or define as the height. We can think of a horizontal plane being passed through the top of the tree and a horizontal plane being passed through the base. And then the vertical separation of those two planes is also the definition of height. How does that fit actual trees? Well, if the tree is vertically oriented, as in the case of this first illustration, we're good to go. But it might seem a little confusing to us if the tree leans. However, if the vertical separation from the top to the base level is the same, that's still the height of that tree. So first tree and second tree are the same height, and that goes for the third tree. So what this illustrates is that the definition we use for height is not synonymous with the length of the trunk. It is the separation, vertical separation of the top of the tree from the base. With that in mind, move to the next slide. Now, today we measure height commonly using instruments. In the older days, we would have used a tape measure, or a tape, 100-foot, possibly 200-foot tape, and an instrument called an inclinometer. But now we're in the age, the space age, we use these high-priced, oftentimes laser measuring devices. Here are some that are still, well, one of them is still in use, but is basically not being manufactured anymore. Nonetheless, a very popular instrument at this time. The Nikon ProStaff 440 was simply a laser rangefinder. What it did was measure distance. On the other hand, more recently, we add instruments like this True Laser Tech Incorporated, True Pulse 360, and the Nikon Forestry Pro. And these are called hypsometers because they are designed to measure tree height. They may measure more than tree height in the case of the True Pulse, but nonetheless, they do the function of a hypsometer, which is to measure tree height. Okay, but there's a lot of more out there. Just to give you a little trip down memory lane, back in the middle 1990s, we started seeing laser rangefinders through a company called Bushnell, and we had a Yardage Pro 800, and it basically had a range of 800 yards or meters. And also they put out a slightly less capable one called the Bushnell Yardage Pro 500. Again, these only measure distance. LaserTech came out with a super device, Impulse, LTI, Impulse 200 LR, LR meaning long range. And it certainly measures tree heights, but it does a lot of kinds of measuring. And they, whoops, sorry about that. I got to go back there. This happens to my mouse every so often. Then we have the device here, True Pulse 200X, which is more recent. And then we have these hybrid devices, True Point 300, which is a total station device. And it measures in lots of different ways, and it has about a 60-page manual or so. And then last, a device that actually also measures in a lot of different ways. And it has actually built into it two lasers, a red beam class 2 laser and an infrared laser. Now, these devices, their hypsometer features are implemented in two ways. Underlying all of the height measuring is trigonometry. And the parts of trigonometry that are used for tree height measuring are generally based on right triangles. And we have two methods called the tangent method and we call the sine method. And virtually all of these instruments use one or both of these methods, whatever they call them. For example, you might find a tree height routine built into one of them called tree height routine. And but it could be called by something else. Nikon, for example, calls their tree height routine also 3-point routine for the tangent method. For the sine method, there are more than one way that the height of a tree might be measured in pieces, for example, whatever the part of it above eye level, the part of it below eye level. And you might call one of these the vertical distance or vertical displacement, nonetheless VD mode, and that would be essentially a sine-based method, and we'll talk about what that means momentarily. Or it might be implemented by something called a missing line routine, the VD mode of that. As you can see, my point is that if you get an instrument and it has methods by which you measure the height of a tree, they're going to call, or they're going to have a name for it, but underlying all of that, they're going to be implementing either the traditional tangent method or the sine method.
Which you prefer?
The sine method is the one that we prefer, and I'll explain that. You can get yourself into trouble pretty quickly with the tangent method, although it is typically called the tree height measuring routine. Now, okay, now let's get into the sine and the tangent methods based upon right triangle trigonometry. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm just going to remind you that from the standpoint of the right triangle, if we take a particular sized angle, and our eye would be back here, and this we would call the vertex angle, then we can get a measure of the size of that angle from the sides themselves. For example, if we divide the length of the opposite side, opposite the vertex angle, by the length of the hypotenuse, the long side of the right triangle, we get that ratio will define the angle. For instance, and that we would call the sine function, the sine of the angle. The sine of the angle is then defined as the opposite side divided by the hypotenuse. If the angle were, for example, 30 degrees, then the sine of that angle would be exactly 0.5. Now, it doesn't matter whether it's a small triangle or a large triangle, right triangle that is. If that vertex angle is 30 degrees, the sine is always the same number. The cosine is defined as the adjacent side of that right triangle divided by the hypotenuse. And again, whether it's the small red triangle or the larger blue triangle, if that angle is the same, then the cosine of the angle will be the same. And this is a way of measuring the angle or relating an angle of a given size to the ratios of the lengths of sides of the triangle. Finally, and traditionally the most important, but not any longer, is the opposite side, its length, divided by the adjacent side, and that's called the tangent function. So the tangent function is what basically instruments like clinometers used. Now, since all of these are defined as algebraic equations or formulas, we can manipulate them. So for example, in the case of the sine function here, we can rearrange or solve for one letter or variable versus the others. And for example, in the first one, if we multiply both sides of this equation by L, then we get this form of it, and that says H equals L times the sine of V. Now let's think about that for a moment. That says that if I know the angle, what it is, for example, and I take its sine through a table or a calculator and multiply the sine of that angle by the length of the hypotenuse, I will get the opposite side, the length of the opposite side. So I know these two quantities and I calculate the third. Looking down here at the tangent, for example, if I know the angle and I take its tangent and I multiply that by the side, the adjacent side, the length of it, then I will get the length of the opposite side. Well, this gives me a powerful means if, in fact, these are the functions that are going to be built into the hypsometers. Now, let's go forward from there and look at the tangent function in particular. And I start with it basically because it's the traditional one. The clinometer is based on it. It is built into almost all of the hypsometers. And as I said, it often is called the tree height measuring routine because it's basically the automation of the manual clinometer method. So just to remind us that the definition of the tangent of an angle is the ratio of the opposite side, and when I mean by that, the length of the opposite side by the length of the adjacent side. So that's this. The tangent of the angle is the opposite side divided by the adjacent side. If we algebraically rearrange this to be H, solve for H, then again, the point is, if we can take the angle A, let's say this is a tree now, and that's its top, and that's at eye level, then if we can take that angle, then we compute the tangent of it using the calculator or a table and multiply it by the length of that side, and presto, we have the height leg. We have measured, in other words, the height of the tree. Now, here is an example of how a hypsometer would actually implement the tangent method. Here's our tree, and it's a well-behaved tree. It's vertically oriented. Its top is vertically positioned over its base. So we have our hypsometer back here. The little guy back here has it in hand. And in fact, what he or she does is he wants to get the level distance from the eye to the trunk of the tree. And to do that, any point on that tree can be hit in that vicinity of that area, and the hypsometer will figure out what that level distance is. But let's say we have the level distance, and that distance is D. And then we take the angle to the base, coming down from eye level to the base, and we call that A subscript 2 or A sub 2. And then we take the angle above eye level from the level line to the top of the tree, and we call that angle A sub 1. If we have those two, then we take using this formula here, we take the tangent of the upper angle times the distance to the trunk, and ooh, that looks odd. We subtract from it the distance to the trunk times the tangent of the lower angle. Now this is algebraic. The point is that by convention, an angle below the level or below our eye in this case, is a negative angle. It's treated as a negative angle. The tangent of a negative angle is a negative number. So if we come out with tangent a subscript 2 as a negative number, then a negative times a negative, that's negative d times the negative angle, turns it into a positive algebraically. So this basically is the same thing as adding the two components, but it's doing it algebraically. And that's why the minus sign is there. You can build that into a mathematical or scientific calculator, and it's so long as you put in the lower angle as a negative number, this will come out to the right value. If you in fact want to do the addition yourself, calculate this separately as a positive entity or amount, quantity, and you calculate that as a positive amount, then you add the two together, then you're being part of the calculator. Anyway, this would be the way a hypsometer would implement the tangent-based function that they might call the tree height routine. And notice that in this case, 3 measurements are being taken: a shot to the trunk, an angle to the base, and an angle to the top. 3 separate measurements, and you come out with the height of the whole tree, in this case, from the base to the top, provided that, of course, the tree is vertically oriented so that we can create these right triangles. Now, what can go wrong? Let me go back a second. I hit one too many. Pardon me. This is just an example of using numbers, in which case if I'm the little person here and I shoot to the trunk, I could shoot to the base if I have that, but I'm simply showing that in this case, we're getting an angle to the base, and I'm assuming that I know I could take it by a tape measure, or I would have a laser probably. At any rate, if I know the distance from my eye to the trunk, level distance is 100 feet, and I know that the base is 8 degrees below an angle of 8 degrees, negative 8, and the angle to the top is 43 degrees, then I can put those numbers into this formula and I'll come out with the height leg of the triangle, or actually it's 2 triangles. It's the triangle that is above eye level and the triangle that's below eye level. And again, that's how these hypsometers actually build in a tree height routine. Now, that's fine and good, but stuff can go wrong. For instance, let's say that we have these 3 trees that are co-aligned at their bases, and the middle one here actually is vertically oriented. The top is vertical over the base. Now I'm back here and I measure the distance from my eye all the way to the trunk of the tree. That's the convention to do that. And I take the angle to the top. Then because I have this right triangle here, when I do the tangent calculation, after I've taken the angle and I've gotten this distance, the B distance, then the tangent calculation will give me this red line. And that will be the height of the tree above eye level. In this case, I'd have to do the same thing to get the total height of the tree below eye level, or I could just add my height to eye level in this case if the ground is level. Nonetheless, my point being that the height of this middle tree here is done correctly. But what if the tree leans forward, as in the case of this one? Now, when I'm back here, again, if I'm following the method that is described by the manufacturers of these hypsometers, I would shoot the trunk of the tree. I would still get that distance all the way from my eye to the trunk. And I would still take the angle to what I saw as the top. But the right triangle that gets created by that is the same one as it was for the middle tree. The actual top of this first tree here, this leaning tree here, the actual top is well out in front of the base. So the triangle I should be measuring is from my eye to this point vertically beneath the top, up to the top and back. That will not be the one that my instrument measures. So what will happen is that I will calculate this height and I will overestimate the height of the actual height of the tree if it's leaning toward me. In the case of the tree that leans away from me, look at that. The actual top of the tree vertically projected down is here. So my baseline should be from my eye all the way to this point vertically beneath the top of the tree. But remembering, I'm doing what the guideline says for the instrument. So I shoot the trunk and I shoot the angle. And again, I will get this height right here as the height of this tree and understate it considerably because the baseline is wrong. So the problem is that with the tangent method, if what you are shooting, if the baseline that you are using, the end of it is not vertically positioned beneath the top of the tree, you're going to come out with a wrong number. And let me tell you, folks, that happens all the time. It happens whether you are a professional forester, whether you're a landscape architect, whether you're an arborist. The math doesn't really care. The instrument doesn't know that the alignment is off. So we needed a better way of measuring trees that take into consideration where their tops actually are relative to their bases. Now, there's more things that can go wrong. For instance, I can be here and the top of the tree could be vertically over the base, but I may never see the top of that tree because an intervening limb thrust out in my direction intercepts my line of sight. So here goes but it may not be that obvious to me, particularly if it's a big tree and a broad crown. So I'll continue to do what the hypsometer tells me, instructions tell me to do. I will shoot the distance level to the trunk. I will take the angle to the top, what I think is the top, but in fact, it's along this line here because that's what I see. And look what happens. Then when I do the tangent calculation, the actual calculation gives me this amount instead of this amount, and I will overestimate the height of the tree. I'll probably do pretty well on the part below eye level if the trunk is straight on down to the ground. Nonetheless, my point being is oftentimes trees get mismeasured because you're really not measuring the top of the tree, but what looks like the top of the tree. And it's perhaps closer to you than at a higher angle than the true top of the tree. With that in mind, let's move on. Now, can we adjust for this? Can we somehow minimize the kind of error that results when the top of the tree is not vertically positioned over the base? Let's take this example here. Looks a little intimidating, but bear with me, I'll get us through it. Let's say that I'm standing here in this position, and I'm looking at what I see here, regardless of whether that's the top or not. That's what I'm seeing, that's what I'm measuring is the top. I take the angle, and here's the line of sight that goes to that point and projects on beyond, but I'm taking again from where I'm standing, I'm taking the distance all the way to the trunk. So the right triangle I'm really measuring is this one, all the way up to there and back down. I'm going to make an error equal to this amount right here. I should have extended this line up to there. I'm going to make this much of an error when I'm this close to the tree. But if I move back to the second position, the blue line, notice that the angle has come down. I'm looking at this point that I'm measuring from a more distant spot. So the triangle now that I'm measuring is from my eye, again to the trunk, up to where this line of sight joins the vertical line to that point. But that's creates a lesser error that results in a lesser error than I did when I was too close. I fade back a little further, and again, the error drops even more. So the lesson to be learned here is that I want to get, in particular, if I'm using the tangent function or the hypsometer with a method described that actually implements the tangent process, then I want to get as far back from the trunk of the tree as I can. And if I can get far enough back, I will minimize the error. As you can see, every time I move further back, this angle comes down more. At infinity, it disappears, but of course, that's not practical. Now, let me summarize. If you're using the tangent method and you have a tree in which the point you're measuring is not vertically positioned over the top, then you're going to make an error with the tangent function, whether you intended to or not. Certainly you don't intend to, but you may not even realize you're making that error. Nonetheless, you can minimize it if you get further back. The further back you get. Now, how far back? Well, if the tree is tall, 100 feet is not anywhere near far enough back, maybe 200 feet, that kind of a number. Okay, let's go to the next one. I put this slide in because there is a way of minimizing the error if you can position yourself in at such a point where, if you visualize a vertical plane and the top of the tree, the point that is in the top of the tree, and the center of the base of the tree, those 2 points are in that vertical plane. If you can get 90 degrees to that vertical plane, positioned at such a point that when you shoot the trunk, you are at that 90-degree angle, the plane runs through these 2 points, then you can use the shot to the trunk as a surrogate for the real baseline, which is the point that's vertically beneath the top. You can still use the tangent method built into the hypsometer and take the angle to the top here. That's the yellow line going up, and the angle right here. That's the angle. You can use that angle and that surrogate distance, the trunk distance, and you'll still make an error, but it will be relatively small. There's not many people can visualize how to position themselves in such a way to get this 90 degree. I have other ways of doing that. It's advanced and it's overkill for this presentation because we hopefully will use the sine method. Still, I'm presenting this because it is traditional, and you may get questions. You may get questions from somebody that has a tape inclinometer. Why is the tape inclinometer enough? Why do you need a hypsometer with all these fancy stuff? These are the reasons why. You can also figure out where the top, if you can spot what you think is the top, and you have 2 tape measures and you have an assistant, you can send them in the direction of the top, walking and guiding them to walk beneath that high point in the crown. They won't know when they pass exactly under it, but they can still keep going and go under it, and do that from 2 directions where those 2 tapes cross on the ground, vertically on from the top down to the ground. That's you're vertically under the top of the tree. This would be a way of figuring out where the top of the tree actually is relative to the trunk. There's more to it than that, because if the trunk is, let's say, higher than this point here on the ground, the point on the ground vertically beneath the top, let's say it's 2 feet higher, then if you measure the vertical distance from the point on the ground beneath the top up to the top, you would have to subtract 2 feet from this offset. There's ways of figuring out that, but I will simply leave it to you is that if you can at least get yourself positioned here, and if the ground is level, you can take care of the problem of the top that you're measuring not being positioned vertically over the base of the tree. Now, that's a lot. but it's necessary in a way to understand what the tangent method doesn't do well. So we created or developed another method, and we could not do this before we had laser rangefinders. The equipment that you need to use the sign method is a laser rangefinder or a hypsometer equivalent. If you're going to use a laser rangefinder and that's all it does, just measure distance, then you need a clinometer or some such a device to measure angle, and you're going to need a scientific calculator. If you got the hypsometer, then hypsometer does all the stuff that's shown there. And I would suggest a digital camera. Now, let's look at what the trigonometry behind the sign method is. That this time your eye is here and the top of the target or the top of the tree is there. Because you've got this laser rangefinder capability, you shoot the direct distance, the length of the hypotenuse of this right triangle, the direct distance from your eye to the target. If you then know the angle, and you would shoot that with your hypsometer would do it, or you would use a angle measure like a clinometer. And if you now know the angle and the direct distance to the target, you can use the sine function, going back to the trigonometry, taking the sine of that angle times the hypotenuse distance, and it is that vertical distance right there that you get. Well, that's the height of the tree or the target, the top, above your eye level. It doesn't matter in that case where the trunk is. You didn't even have to have a trunk for that matter of fact. You can measure above your eye level the height of the target, and then keeping your eye in the same position, you can do the same for the base. If you add those two numbers, you've got the height of the tree irrespective of the architecture of the tree. Now, in case you have, again, you have let's say a clinometer and you have a laser rangefinder, this is what you would do. You would shoot hypotenuse distance to the top and take the angle, and then multiply the sine of that angle by that hypotenuse distance. And then you would take the angle to the base, that's a negative angle, and then you would take the sine of a negative angle times the, in fact, hypotenuse distance to the base, and it will come out to be, through the algebra, it'll come out to be the total height of the tree from the top to the base. So there you have it. That's what you would do with tape and clinometer. All that gets done for you automatically with the hypsometer. Now,
laser rangefinder and clinometer.
Again, laser rangefinder and clinometer is this. The hypsometer would do all this for you. Okay, now let's go to another case. There are situations where you can combine the two methods, sine and tangent. Let's say that you have to be able to see the top. And so you're here and you take the hypotenuse distance from your eye to the top, and that's the L sub 1, and you take the angle, and that's A sub 1. So the sine of that angle times that hypotenuse distance is this piece of the height. It's the piece of the height that's above your eye level. Turning to the part toward the base, suppose there's vegetation in the way. You can maybe dimly see where the base is with your eye, but you can't get a successful laser shot down to the base. Then you can possibly pick it or choose a point that you can see on the trunk, probably close to your eye level, but it really doesn't matter, and take that distance with your laser and that angle. And then if you have the distance from your eye to that point on the trunk, and you have the angle to that point on the trunk below eye, then this calculation up here, using the cosine of the angle times the hypotenuse distance, will give you the level line from your eye to the trunk. So this is the way of getting the level line to the trunk, which can be used for the base. Can't be used for the top in this case, but can be used for the base. So in that particular case, then you're now going down and you can then shoot the angle, and that's a sub 2, from your eye to the base of the tree. You've already got the distance, level distance to the trunk, and you can run those through that calculation, that part of the formula, and you will get the full height of the tree. Now, this is not built into the hypsometers, but you can do it. So you're going to have to use the rangefinder capability and the angle measuring capability of your instruments to get this part, the tangent based part of the height of the tree. So, and then you can use your features of your instruments to get the sine based part of the tree and combine the two, even if you can't see with the laser the base of the tree, so that you can't apply the sine function as within the previous slide. You can't use the sine function totally. Maybe you can combine sine and tangent. And I do this all the time, by the way. I'm always running into this kind of a situation. Okay, now that's a lot, but let's review a little bit. Why is the sine method preferred to the tangent method, regardless of whether or not your instrument calls the tangent method the tree measuring or tree height measuring method? The sine method entirely eliminates the height errors that result from a top to base horizontal separation, i.e., that is to say, when the top of the tree is not vertically positioned over the base, the bane of the tangent method. You don't have to worry about that with the sine method. In the case of smaller errors in height resulting from instrument and angle or distant or combined errors, they are magnified with the tangent method. That is to say, those errors in the height that result from errors in the angle measuring part of your instrument or the distance measuring part, the errors of those sensors, the impact of them is lesser in sine-based calculations than in the tangent-based calculations. This is relatively minor for the most part. Here's the big problem. What is the biggest challenge, though, for the sine method? There's got to be some downside, at least a little one. Well, hitting the target with the laser beam. That, if there's clutter in the way, may, in some cases, preclude you from actually using the sine method. So you have to go back and approximate with the tangent method and try to figure out where you are relative in terms of the top relative to the base. So you minimize that offset error as much as you can. What I'm simply saying is that sometimes you really do have to revert to the tangent method. Now, another challenge here is, and it's been a challenge throughout, and it'll plague you, I assure you, is knowing really where the top of the tree is. You're standing back and looking, this is a sycamore in Look Park in Northampton, Massachusetts. Most people standing back are going to figure that that's the top of the tree. It's at the highest angle. It looks to be the top, but it is not the highest point in the crown. Thing hesitated there. Now, that in this tree is actually the highest point. It doesn't look to be the highest point because it's physically further away. It's farther back into the crown and at a lower angle than the apparent looking top. How are you going to know that? Well, you have to shoot all those tops with the sine method separately until you find the highest one. It's as simple as that. So to illustrate that point a little better, there are a lot of points up in the top of the canopy of the tree that may be candidates for the highest top. And if you project, we're able to project them down to where they fall on the ground beneath the top of vertical projection down relative to where the base of the tree is. They can be all over the place. You're over here somewhere, and These points right here at a distance may look about the same distance away. Just remember that they aren't. You have no choice other than to shoot each of these points separately until you find the top. But that's not that onerous. It only takes a couple of minutes extra. You shoot, 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 and you've got it. Okay, I just always like to throw in one of my pet trees, and this is the Bryant pine from the William Cullen Bryant homestead in Cummington, Mass. That he was the Bryant of Bryant Park in New York. And this is a beauty. It's 163 feet tall, and there its statistics and big tree points or champion tree points 301. Mass as a whole, state champion is 334. I measure this tree every time the wind blows. I go out there and check it to keep track of it, and not a slouchy tree. Well, I'm not going to cover these advanced topics because I don't have the time, maybe in another session. So at this point, I'm going to stop that and minimize it. And I still have the, I'm still,
Questions.
I guess I should ask, are there any questions at this point? Hello? Does anybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
All right. If there aren't any questions, then I'll move on to circumference, which I promise will be simpler. We okay to go?
I'm good. I'm just listening.
Okay, thanks. Okay, play from the start. Here we go. Okay, here we go again. This is circumference. How do we measure circumference? Okay, we'll cover basic circumference, and we'll have some advanced measurements that I can cover, and then talk about the bane of the champion tree program. Is it a single tree, or is it really several trunks pressed together? And how do we treat that? Now, let me go back this thing. Here's the idea. We want to measure the circumference at 4.5 feet above the ground. That's typically what instructions will tell us to do. If the tree is vertically positioned and it's on level ground, then it's pretty easy to figure out where 4.5 feet is above the base, and then wrap the tape around the trunk at that point, perpendicular to the center line from the ground up to the center of the trunk. That's essentially, most people are going to do that pretty much. That's the way you tend to do it. If the tree, anyway, if the tree is vertical. But what if the tree is leaning? If the tree is leaning, then we want to measure the circumference perpendicular to the central axis of the trunk. And we want to measure 4.5 feet up from along that center line. So this is the 4.5 feet on this leaning tree. This is the 4.5 on this vertically oriented tree. This is the circumference line for this leaning tree that's 90 degrees to the central axis. This is 90 degrees to the central axis. And that takes care of these two situations where the tree is on level ground. One is leaning, one's not. The trunk, I mean, is leaning. What if we don't have level ground? Well, then we have to go to the center point of the slope. Here's the middle of the slope coming down, and then we go vertically up there from that middle point there. Just to make a point over here, this is really no different from this, except I might be running into a problem here if I find that these, what appear to be limbs, are in fact separate trunks. I will get to that. Because I'm going to often run into a situation where I have more than one trunk, even though they're pressed together and the bark has grown around the division points so it can look like a single tree. In the case of trees 1 and 6, no problem. I can establish the 4.5 foot point and measure the single trunk at those points, like in the preceding diagram. I know what to do in the case of the leaning trunk. I know that I have to go up 4.5 feet and then measure perpendicular to that line. I know what to do if the tree is on leaning ground. I go to the center of the slope and move up 4.5 feet, falling again, wherever it is, the center line of the trunk. Well, what happens in these situations? In this case, if I judge this to be one tree, and these are basically branches or limbs coming off of the main trunk just low to the ground, and 4.5 feet up is below I get to the limbs, then there's no point, there's no problem. I simply measure the circumference as I would with these other trees. If these are separate trunks, but they seem to have come together, and I can't rule out that it's one pith line at the base, I'll still treat it as one tree. On the other hand, if it isn't, then I've got to do something else, and that will be something called functional circumference, covered later. In the case where I have two trunks, and in this particular case, I can see, or 4.5 feet up above the ground, they are separate. If I judge these to be two separate trees and just happen to be pressed together, I will simply measure the larger of the trunks. I will not measure both of them combined. On the other hand, if I'm not sure, and I believe this to be possibly a single pith at the base, one tree, then I've got this functional circumference method to deal with the two trunks. Or I could possibly simply go to the narrowest point between 4.5 feet in the base, somewhere in there, wherever the narrowest point is, after I get below the split, that is to say, and measure the narrowest circumference from that point to the base. I could do that also. Both of these methods can be applied. We're going to be changing the guidelines, American Forest guidelines, to use functional circumference in this case. There, let's see, I always have to make sure this thing jumps to when I come. Okay, now, if the tree is on leaning ground or sloping ground, I mean, if the tree is on sloping ground, and I'm not sure that I can locate the middle of the slope or the somewhere in here. It looks kind of obvious here, but maybe I can't for one reason or another locate it. I might be able to do this. I go to the lower side and find out where 4.5 feet is above the lower base side and measure the circumference, provided I don't run into ground. I just make it in this case. And I've got the circumference from going up 4.5 feet from downhill side. I do the same thing from the uphill side, go up 4.5 feet from the uphill side and measure the circumference. I then can go halfway in between those two measurements and measure at that point, and that would be the circumference, or I could simply average the circumference gotten from this uphill side with this downhill side. Both are acceptable. I usually try to see if they differ. If I can do it both ways, then the question is, which one do I use? Well, I'm still going to try to find the center. If they're different, I'm going to try to find the middle of the ground and see if I can find one being closer to going up somewhere in this spot here, middle of the slope. And if I come closer to one of those numbers, the other, I'll use it. it's not a perfect situation. In this case, you can always simply default to averaging those two or one or the other. Now, one point I want to again emphasize that if the trunk is leaning and your own sloping ground, this is what you're doing. You're finding mid slope and you're going up 4.5 feet, following the center line of the tree, and then you're taking the circumference at 90 degrees to the center line. These are basically the scenarios in which you have to deal with a lean and sloping ground in any combination. Now, in this case, let's see what we can do. Ooh, now I just ran this one in because there's always reality. This is the Texas Champion live oak, and this is our friend Larry Tusi down there. And if you go up 4.5 feet, you're going to run into limbs. So we can't, and this is judged to be a single tree. I'm not going to dispute it one way or another. I'll accept it. If they say it's a single tree and it branches in this way, what would I do there? I would simply go to the narrowest point between these limbs, where these limbs come together, the narrowest point where I've got trunk between there and the ground, and that's what I would measure as the circumference of that tree. There's not much else you can do. If you get up into the limbs, then that isn't going to work at all. So you got to get below the limbs. I think we would all probably recognize this. Seems intuitive that this is the way we deal with this. Now, if this is judged to be two separate trees, we have this thing called the functional circumference that we could use. But all things considered, I think we'll probably continue to accept taking this circumference at the lowest point between where the limbs end and the ground begins, the narrowest point, I mean. Suppose that we can't get to the trunk of the tree because we see the tree and we'd like to measure it, but it's on private land, the owner isn't there. And we're not even sure that it's going to be a champion. Is there any way that we can measure that tree, the diameter of that tree from a distance? Well, this isn't from a distance. These are calipers. If we went up to the trunk of the tree and we use calipers, that's measuring the width of the trunk at that point. That's all we can really do from a distance. Whatever we see, we could measure. So what I'm going to take you into next is the equivalent of this caliper measurement. Now, you have an instrument called a monocular, and its binoculars are two magnifiers, and a monocular is one. But if you have a scale across the lens of the monocular, you can use that to actually measure width at a distance. Let's see how that might work. A monocular has a scale on it, and it might look something like that. So if you're at a distance and you have to know what that distance is, then you can see the trunk, you can see the scale of the monocular against the trunk in the distance and count the number of tick marks that are included by the trunk. If you can get that kind of a measurement and you know the distance to the center of the trunk, the middle of the trunk, then you can actually calculate, with a simple formula, you can calculate the apparent width of the trunk at that point. You have for each of these reticles a factor. It's called the reticle factor, as a matter of fact. And I'm going to call that, it'll be given to you. You'll know it from the manufacturer. And I'm going to call that M, is the reticle factor or reticle reading. And then if you've taken the distance to the middle of the front of the trunk, then the reticle reading, the reticle reading is what you actually saw when you looked at the the trunk and you counted the scales, excuse me, it goes back again. When you count all the tick marks, that's the reticle reading. The factor that the manufacturer gives you is this goes with that particular instrument, and I'm going to call it F. Then all you have to do is multiply the distance times your reticle reading divided by the factor, and you will get the width of the target object. Well, almost. That's the way they're designed. Let me go back a second. What they're really designed to do is measure the width of a flat object, like a window, an opening, a window, or a door at a distance. They didn't really anticipate that you're measuring a surface that is not flat, but is, in fact, in this case, almost circular. So I derived a correction that will take care of the fact that what you're measuring is not flat surface, but a circle. And this is the formula that is required. You shoot the distance from your eye to the middle of the trunk. And then you have from that the reticle reading that you would get, such as we saw, and then you put the distance times the reticle reading divided by the factor, the manufacturer's reticle factor, minus half of your reticle reading, and that will take care of the circularity, and you'll get the right width. Now that isn't telling you that this is actually an absolutely circular object. There could be a little error if the trunk is non-circular, but this will be better than treating the trunk as if it were a flat surface. I actually put in another method. If you have an iPhone app, such as theodolite or sea level, you can actually measure the angle, be back here, and you can measure the angle subtended by your eye, subtended by the trunk from your eye, and that would be this alpha right here. You can get that out of your theodolite or your sea level, and then if you shoot the distance to the middle of the trunk, then you can in fact calculate the width through this formula here. So we have a couple of ways in these two methods that you can shoot the distance. You can measure the width of an object in the distance using an iPhone app. This is what theodolite would look like. And in this particular case, here's the trunk of the tree, and all of this stuff that the theodolite is giving you is the angles that are both vertical angle, horizontal angle, and azimuth. The azimuth reading is down here. This is 6 degrees and 107 mils, which is 107,000. So it's basically 107 over 1,000 beyond 6 degrees. You get the angle here just directly read off, and you had to line up. You go through a process, and I'm not going to try to describe the process here. I just want you to be aware of the fact that you do have these kinds of tools at your disposal if you want to approximate the circumference of the tree. Of course, once you get the width, then you're just multiplying by pi to get the computed circumference, and that would be an estimate. Something else that comes into play is if you know that your trunk is not circular, and you could, let's say, measure with calipers the width here and the width there, then half of those widths, that being A, that represents a radius, except that it's not a radius of a circle, it's really a radius of an ellipse, and it would be called something like semi-major axis. And in this direction, that would be a semi-major axis. This would be semi-major in this direction, and this would be this would be the major axis. Then you have a formula that you could compute the perimeter value. Well, the perimeter value is whatever it is. If you can get to the tree and you can wrap a tape around it, you don't need to do that. But if you're shooting the tree from a distance, as I showed in the past slides, where you're taking this width and going 90 degrees and taking that width, then you can compute the perimeter treated as an ellipse and come out with a better figure than if you just treated it from one direction, such as over here, and shooting and just getting that width and in computing the circumference on the basis of assuming that would be a circle. You can do that. Those methods are available to you. The biggest challenge is single tree versus multiple trees. How can we tell? Well, a lot of it is looking at the tree itself. And there we go. Here's, if we see a split coming down between the two, then we would call these two trunks if that split goes all the way down to the ground. So we're actually looking for the visible signs of two trunks. We use pith. If we followed a trunk, for example, here, and we follow the pith line and we consider this to be two trunks, a pith line would come down here. And if we're following this, we follow the pith line approximately, it would come down there, and those pith lines would not join at the ground. If they did, then we could call it one tree. If they don't, then we would call it two trunks or two trees. And here's an example of that. These are two trunks. You know, these were two trees that grew together, pressed together, and there we have them. Would it be fair to measure this as a single tree? Not really. There's another example of a tree. This is a national champion Louisiana ball cypress, and they got by with that, and they continue to get by with it until we come up with something that absolutely precludes this sort of thing. We're working on it. And here's another one. This is treated as one tree, a peach leaf willow. Well, it's a huge coppice. Now, I cannot prove that it didn't start from a single seed, but we can, if we need to, and we will, treat this as separate trunks and compute basically a functional circumference. And that brings me to the final slide here of what a functional circumference is. If we can take and measure the circumference of each of the separate trunks at 4.5 feet above the ground, we run them through this simple formula here and come out with an equivalent circumference, equivalent as though if it were a single trunk. I will explain that in terms of forestry, what that basically does is this. It takes the cross-sectional area of this trunk, the cross-sectional area of that trunk, the cross-sectional area of that trunk, adds the three together as one big trunk, and then back computes the circumference that it would take to get that much cross-sectional area. That, in a nutshell, is functional circumference. So you're comparing the same amount of cross-sectional area. Well, that's the end of that slideshow. And I'm going to close that. Ooh, I'm sorry, I did. I shouldn't have closed it, but I did. Now, okay, now the next one is the crown spread. How am I doing on time?
11:49.
I've got to rush on this. Okay.
11 minutes.
I've got place to start. Okay, here we go on crown spread. I think we all have a pretty good idea what we mean by crown spread. Stand back at the tree and you look at it, and however wide the crown appears to be, that's what we mean by crown spread. And it makes sense from a distance. Here is a an American elm that was in Johnstown, New York, and we look and we can say, oh, the spread of the crown is from here all the way over to there. But as we get closer and we get under the crown, figuring out where the extremes of the crown are become a real problem. This is a sycamore in Simsbury, Connecticut, called the Gifford-Pinchot sycamore. Or we get into an even worse case of this tree, this white oak, and you can see that the limbs stretch out in all directions, go down, touch the ground, come up. So how in the world do we figure out crown spread there? We have to pretty much idealize the crown to get a definition. And so if we can project down from the extremities of the crown to the ground and follow that pathway, it might be called a drip line, where if the crown was solid and the rain was coming down vertically, then whatever was not wet inside here would delineate the edges of the crown. Then wherever that was widest, that would be the one measure of the crown spread. Then what if we could get that measurement? There are of course possible problems for that, how you actually do that, but I don't have much time, so I'm going to continue working on here. Here we have that kind of distance that we figured out from the drip line. If we go 90 degrees to that and find the maximum width at 90 degrees to the maximum overall and get those two numbers and average of them, that would be the average crown spread. Now, when we convert that to points, for big tree points, of course, we take only a quarter of that, but we first get the average crown spread. And we can have problems because if we're on sloping ground, we really are looking at the horizontal distance across the crown, not the sloping ground distance. There's some trigonometry here that we could do if we have an angle measure and the distance on the ground to actually measure this distance, blue line, and the angle and compute the equivalent horizontal distance there. I show that in the example. I'll be sending these three PowerPoints to Sharon, and then she can use them or share them with you as she sees fit. I just point out that crown shapes can be very different. So when you start to try to figure out, well, in this case, seems simple enough. In this case, seems simple enough. But finding those average, the widest spread is a bit of a challenge that you have to go through. I think I'm probably close to out of time.
No, 11:53.
Okay, I've got a few more minutes. Spoke methods. Here is one for you all that I wouldn't give to the general public. But if you've got one of these situations where the crown is really irregular and it's not easy to treat it like it's one big ellipse or circle, then you can use this. You use the spoke method. Circle the tree, periodically shooting distances, level distances from the edge of the crown, and you've got to align yourself to be under the edge of the crown, and shoot level distances to the trunk. Go all the way around that, and then you're shooting it to the edge of the trunk here, of course, and then you come and you compute the average of all of that. These are called spokes. And the whole distance across basically is, let's say, coming all the way across, you've got the spoke on each side. So there's two spokes there, and you've got the diameter of the tree itself in between. So this formula takes you through the spoke method completely, making sure that you've taken the diameter of the tree, which is part of it. And that would give you the most accurate determination of crown spread that you're likely to get. There's an example of how that would play out with actual numbers. You can see the numbers. These are the spokes up here. And then I run them through the formula. and then I'm basically multiplying by 2 because twice the spoke is the part that you measured, and then you have to add in the diameter. You can get by with a slightly simpler version if you shoot to the edge of the tree, the distance to the edge of the tree, which then approximates where you're shooting to the center of the tree, and then you don't add in the diameter. The formula is a little simpler. You're shooting as you go around the tree from where you are on the drip line to the edge of the circumference of the edge of the side of the tree. And therefore, when you're going around, you're really trying to come into essentially what the center point of the tree would be. How am I doing?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Let's see here. You can have more complicated methods of doing it from a distance. If again, you're far back and you can't get to the drip line, and you can see the edges of the tree from a distance, and you've got your laser rangefinder and your angle measure, the tilt sensor of your instrument or whatever, then you could shoot a distance to a point that you're going to say that's the forest to the left side of the crown I'm going to go, shoot that distance and that angle, shoot the corresponding as far out as you can go on the right-hand side, the distance and the angle, and then compute from that basically by using then your, well, you probably have a compass, shoot the azimuth in this direction, the azimuth and that, and figure out the angle in between. If you do that, you can use the law of cosines to compute this distance here, and that would be the distance, essentially the level distance across on the ground between piece of 1 and piece of 3. That will work if you can't get to the tree reasonably well. And these are calculations that show it. And as a final slide, here's a great tree in which I would do that sort of calculation for, because we're not allowed to go down to the tree any longer. And I can see the sides of it. So I would probably, if I couldn't do it in any other way, I would do
What's
it
the
that
name of
way.
the tree?
And that is by the
Go
way,
back.
that tree is the Pine Plains sycamore in New York, and it's the state champion. And I think with that, I'm basically out of time. So I just went off launch meeting. What happened here? Am I off? Whoops.
We no longer
Back,
see your
yes.
screen.
Hello?
We can still see you. We're just looking at a black screen on the share
Okay,
screen.
stop sharing. Let me stop sharing there. Oh, okay. Now, I apologize. I had set this up to be a little longer. I wound up having to kind of rush through this stuff. So what I'll do is make this available to Sharon, of course, and then you can look at the slides, and then you're more than welcome to contact me directly. Sharon can give you my email address. And if you have questions on any of these, by all means, please do contact me.